Aries, before you scroll, before you decide this is just another message, pause. Because this Sunday the 28th doesn't feel loud, it feels different. Like something inside you has stopped pushing and started listening. Tell me, when was the last time you felt this quiet tension in your chest? Not fear, not exhaustion, but that subtle knowing that says something is about to shift. This isn't a warning, and it's not coincidence that you're here. 3 movements are lining up, back to back, not to test you, but to redirect you. So stay with me. And if you feel it too, leave a sign in the comments and trust yourself enough to hear what comes next. Because this moment didn't find you by accident. Aries, stay with me for a moment. This Sunday the 28th isn't here to rush you. It isn't asking you to prove anything, and it's not another finish line you have to break through. It's quieter than that, almost deceptively so. Think of it like this: a fire that has burned outward for a long time suddenly turns inward, not to weaken, but to refine. You're used to momentum, used to pushing forward even when the ground beneath you felt unstable. You've lived in motion for so long that stillness can feel unfamiliar, almost suspicious. But today doesn't feel empty. It feels weighted, like something has shifted beneath your feet without making a sound. No applause, no announcement, just a subtle realignment you can feel in your chest if you slow down enough to notice. And maybe that's what's been confusing you. Because this doesn't feel like exhaustion. It doesn't feel like burnout. It feels intentional. If today feels slower than usual, if your thoughts feel deeper, if you're not reaching for the next thing as fast as you normally do, that isn't weakness. That's awareness. This Sunday is a hinge, a quiet one. The kind that doesn't close a door behind you, but gently shifts the direction the door opens next. You haven't lost your fire. You're learning how to aim it. For so long your instinct has been to move outward. Fix it, fight it, push through it. But this moment isn't asking for force, it's asking for honesty. The kind of honesty that happens when no one is watching, when there's no one to impress, when the noise finally drops low enough for you to hear yourself think. And if you're feeling that strange pause today, that sense that something is ending without drama, that's not because something is wrong. It's because something is complete. Some chapters don't close with conflict, they close with clarity. And clarity doesn't shout, it settles. You may notice it in small ways. A sudden lack of urgency around something that used to consume you. A decision you thought you had to make immediately, that now feels like it can wait. A quiet pull toward rest instead of reaction. None of that is accidental. This turning point isn't about doing more. It's about doing less of what no longer fits. You're not falling behind. You're repositioning. And the reason this moment feels subtle is because it's foundational. It's the kind of shift that changes the way you walk forward, not just where you're headed. So don't rush past this feeling. Don't label it as laziness or doubt. Let it speak. Because this pause you're standing in right now, it's creating space. And what begins to move next doesn't come from effort. It comes from alignment. Just breathe here for a second. Let the ground settle. Let your energy collect itself. There's a reason this moment asked you to slow down before anything else could move. And maybe now, as you stand in this quieter space, you're starting to notice something you've rarely let yourself admit. You've been strong for a very long time. Not the kind of strength people clap for. Not the loud, heroic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up early, carries more than its share, and keeps moving, even when no one asks how heavy it feels. You've always been the one who steps forward first. The one who takes the hit. The one who says, "I've got it," even when part of you is already tired. And you learned early that slowing down felt dangerous. That softness looked like weakness. That if you didn't keep going, everything might fall apart. So you didn't pause, you didn't ask, you didn't complain, you just endured. But here's the truth I want you to hear, Aries. Not as a lesson, not as advice, just as something honest between us. You're not exhausted because you act. You're exhausted because you've been giving more than you receive for longer than you were ever meant to. You burn bright by nature. That fire is who you are. But no flame is meant to survive without warmth coming back. And somewhere along the way, you started mistaking self-sacrifice for purpose, pushing through for progress, carrying weight as proof of worth. You told yourself this is just how life works. That strength means staying silent. That asking for more would make you selfish. That rest would slow you down. But this moment, this Sunday, isn't asking you to push again. It's asking you to stop proving. Because you don't need to earn your value by breaking yourself into pieces. You never did. The universe isn't watching you right now thinking, try harder. It's watching and saying you've done enough. There's a deep difference between courage and self-abandonment. And you've crossed that line more times than you realize because you thought it was required of you. You kept going when it would have been easier to harden. You stayed present when disappearing would have hurt less. You held your ground without asking for recognition. That wasn't weakness. That was devotion. But devotion without return becomes depletion. And depletion is not destiny. So if something inside you feels like it's finally loosening, like the need to carry everyone else, first, like the urgency to keep proving you can handle it all, that isn't you giving up. That's you coming back to yourself. You're allowed to stop burning just to be seen. You're allowed to let life meet you halfway. You're allowed to receive without apologizing. And as this settles in, as your breath deepens, as your shoulders drop just a little, you may begin to sense something else rising quietly. Not pressure, not demand. A signal, one that doesn't shout. One that waits patiently until you're ready to notice it. And that's where we go next. And that signal I mentioned, it doesn't arrive the way you were taught to expect. It doesn't come with flashing lights. It doesn't interrupt your life with chaos. It doesn't demand your attention. It waits. You might have already felt it without naming it. A slight hesitation where there used to be certainty. A pause before a decision you've made 100 times before. That moment when your body slows down, even though your mind says keep going. That's the sign. Not superstition, not fear, not imagination. It's awareness catching up to momentum. For someone like you, Aries, this can feel unsettling. You're used to clarity coming through action. You trust movement. You trust instinct. So when something inside you gently presses the brakes, your first impulse is to override it. To push through. To tell yourself you're overthinking. But this feeling isn't doubt. It's discernment. It shows up as a thought that keeps returning, quietly, patiently. Not loud enough to argue with. Not urgent enough to force a choice. Just persistent enough that you can't fully ignore it anymore. You might notice it in a relationship that suddenly feels heavier than it should. Not dramatic, just draining in a way you can't explain. Or in a habit that once gave you relief, but now leaves you feeling oddly empty afterward. Or in a path you've been walking confidently, until one day your steps don't land the same way they used to. This isn't the universe trying to scare you. It's not a warning meant to paralyze you. It's a checkpoint, a moment of truth placed gently in your way, before momentum turns into regret. You see, the sign doesn't show up to stop your fire. It shows up to aim it. You've already learned how to survive by charging forward. What you're learning now is how to live without burning yourself down in the process. And this sign respects you enough not to shout. It trusts that you're capable of listening once the noise quiets. That's why it feels subtle. That's why it feels internal. That's why no one else seems to notice it but you. It's not meant for everyone. It's meant for you. And if part of you has been feeling restless without knowing why, or unusually reflective, or strangely unwilling to make a decision you used to rush into, that's not resistance. That's intelligence. The kind that comes from experience, from having already lived the consequences of moving too fast. From knowing that not every battle is meant to be charged into. This pause isn't asking you to retreat, it's asking you to redirect. To choose with clarity instead of habit. To respond instead of react. And once you recognize that, something shifts again. Because the moment you stop forcing yourself forward, space opens. Not emptiness, possibility. And in that space, something begins to loosen inside you. Something you've been holding far longer than you realized. Just let yourself stay here for a breath longer. You don't need to decide anything yet. You don't need to explain anything, because what comes next isn't about action. It's about release. And right here in this space, you didn't rush through. Something begins to change first, not outside you but inside. It's subtle, almost easy to miss. A loosening in your chest, like you've been holding your breath for years and only now realize it. That pressure you thought was just part of life, that constant edge, you learn to live with it, starts to soften, not disappear all at once. Just enough for you to feel the difference. You may notice it when a familiar memory surfaces and it doesn't sting the way it used to. or when anger that once flared instantly no longer finds fuel. It doesn't mean what happened was acceptable. It doesn't mean it didn't matter. It means you're no longer carrying it the same way. This is the first shift, and it doesn't arrive with confrontation. It doesn't require a conversation. It doesn't need anyone else to change. No one has to come back. No one has to explain themselves. No apology needs to land in your hands for this to happen, because what's releasing now was never waiting on permission from the outside. You've been fighting something internally for a long time, Aries. Replaying moments, rewriting endings, bracing for reactions that may never come. You told yourself you needed closure. You told yourself peace would arrive after the final word, after the truth was admitted, after you were understood. But that kept you tethered to battles that were already over, and now without a decision, without a declaration, you stop swinging. Not because you lost, but because you don't need to win anymore. The fire inside you doesn't go out. It simply stops burning in self-defense. You realize you don't need to stay on guard to stay powerful. You don't need to stay angry to stay awake. This peace isn't numbness. It's clarity without tension. It's the moment you recognize that holding on was costing you more than letting go ever could. And as this settles, you may feel a quiet sadness move through you, not heavy, just honest. Grief for how long you carried what wasn't yours. Compassion for the version of you who thought strength meant never setting anything down. Let that feeling pass through. It doesn't come to weaken you. It comes to clean the wound. Because peace that comes from stopping the fight is different from peace that comes from winning one. This peace stays. It doesn't depend on circumstances. It doesn't flare and fade. It anchors. And once you're no longer spending energy defending old ground, something else becomes possible. Space opens. Not empty space, but usable space. Room for something to return to you without force, without struggle, without you having to chase it. Just notice that. The stillness. The quiet relief. The sense that something heavy has finally been set down. Stay with that feeling a moment longer. Because when the heart releases its grip, the hands are finally free to receive. And that's where the next movement begins. And once that weight leaves your chest, once your hands are no longer clenched around what hurt you, something else begins to move. Quietly. Almost politely. It doesn't rush in. It doesn't announce itself. It simply starts finding its way back to you. Money feels different now. Not louder, not flashier, just clearer. You've never really chased wealth for ego. What you've wanted was fairness. A sense that what you give will eventually meet you halfway. And for a long time it didn't. You showed up early. You stayed late. You carried responsibility like it was second nature. You poured energy into people, places, and promises that never quite returned the same care. So this shift doesn't arrive as a prize. It arrives as balance, a recalibration. You may notice it in small, grounded ways. An opportunity that finally fits instead of draining you. A conversation that opens a door you thought had closed. A number that lands differently than you expected. Not dramatic, just right. And what matters most is this. You're not receiving more because you're doing more. You're receiving because you stopped giving where it was leaking away. That's the difference. For so long, you equated effort with worth. If it was hard, it must be meaningful. If it hurt, it must be necessary. But something shifted when you released the fight. Your energy stopped scattering. It stopped bleeding into places that couldn't hold it. And life noticed. This isn't about luck suddenly smiling on you. It's about alignment responding to clarity. You're no longer negotiating your value in silence. You're no longer accepting half returns just to keep the peace. You're no longer trying to be indispensable at your own expense. And because of that, what comes back to you now has weight. It has substance. It stays. You might feel a moment of hesitation when it arrives. A reflex that says, is this real? Do I deserve this? Should I wait? That's old programming. Learned in seasons where receiving felt unsafe. Let it pass. You don't need to justify this return. You don't need to over-explain it. You don't need to work twice as hard to keep it. This isn't compensation for pain. It's recognition of value. Your tears didn't buy this moment. But they refined you enough to know what to accept and what to turn away from. You've learned the cost of giving too much. Now you're learning the grace of letting things meet you. And notice how this feels in your body. Not rushed. Not sharp. Steady. Like something settling into place instead of pulling you forward. That's how you know this is real. Stay open here. Not desperate, not gripping. Just present. Because as the flow returns externally, another shift is already forming internally. A new way of seeing, a new way of choosing, and it's about to show you what you no longer need to carry forward. Just breathe with that for a moment, and as things begin to settle on the outside, something even quieter sharpens on the inside. Clarity, not the kind that hits you all at once, not a sudden realization that knocks you over. This one arrives slowly, like fog lifting from a familiar road. You start to see patterns you've walked through before. Moments that once felt separate now line up. Conversations, choices, endings that all shared the same rhythm. And instead of blaming yourself, you simply notice. You see how often you repeated cycles out of loyalty. How many times you stayed because leaving felt like failure. How frequently you tried to bring people with you, even when your growth was asking for space. This clarity isn't judgment, it's perspective. You're not angry about the past. You're just no longer confused by it. And that changes everything. For someone like you, Aries, this is a deep kind of maturity, because you've always been willing to fight for what matters, to prove your strength, to show your commitment through action. But now you realize something subtle and powerful. You don't need to prove who you are anymore. You don't need to explain your evolution. You don't need to drag anyone forward just to justify your direction. Some people knew you in survival mode. Some loved you in struggle. Some felt comfortable when you were overextending yourself. That doesn't make them bad. It just makes them part of an earlier chapter. And here's the truth that settles gently into your chest. Not everyone who walked beside you is meant to walk with you into what's next. That understanding doesn't harden you. It softens you. You stop forcing alignment. You stop negotiating your pace. You stop shrinking your vision to keep others comfortable. You begin choosing with intention instead of impulse, with honesty instead of habit. And this clarity doesn't isolate you. It liberates you, because you no longer confuse attachment with love, or consistency with compatibility, or history with destiny. You learn that letting go can be an act of respect, for yourself and for others. There's relief in this awareness, not loud relief, the quiet kind. The kind that lets you breathe without checking who's watching. The kind that allows you to say no without rehearsing an explanation. The kind that trusts silence instead of filling it. You notice how your energy changes when you stop pushing, how your body relaxes when you stop trying to be everything for everyone, how your thoughts slow when you give yourself permission to choose peace. This is discernment, not distance, and it prepares you for what comes next. Because clarity doesn't just remove what no longer fits, it creates room. Room for timing to make sense. Room for past delays to reveal their purpose. Room for you to understand why certain doors never opened when you wanted them to. So let yourself sit with this knowing. No urgency, no rush, just presence. Because when you finally see where you've been clearly, you're ready to understand why everything had to unfold the way it did. And that understanding is already beginning to rise. And now, as everything begins to make sense inside you, the question quietly forms. Why now? Why this moment? Why this Sunday? There's something about Sundays that most people overlook. They aren't meant for pushing forward. They aren't built for proving anything. Sundays are thresholds, the place where one cycle exhales before the next one begins. And this Sunday, the 28th, carries that energy in a deeper way for you. It isn't here to give you answers right away. It's here to reset the way you receive them. You've spent years moving through delays that felt unnecessary. Doors that didn't open when you were ready. Opportunities that hovered just out of reach. Moments where you did everything right and still had to wait. And I know how frustrating that felt for someone like you. Because waiting has never been your nature. You move when you feel called. You act when something matters. So those pauses felt personal, like life was withholding something you had earned. But listen to this gently. Those delays were not punishment. They were protection. If what's arriving now had come earlier, you would have used it to survive. You would have carried it while still carrying everything else. You would have stretched yourself thinner instead of living fuller. You weren't ready to receive then, not because you lacked strength, but because you hadn't yet learned how to stop enduring. Timing isn't about readiness of circumstance. It's about readiness of the soul, and yours needed space to soften. To release the reflex of struggle, to unlearn the belief that value only comes through effort. That's why this moment had to wait until now. Until you knew how to set things down. until you stopped bracing for impact, until you could tell the difference between motion and meaning. This Sunday doesn't rush you because it knows you finally know how to stay. It closes a chapter not with drama, but with understanding. You may feel it as a quiet acceptance, a sense that certain things didn't happen because they couldn't last, that certain people left because they weren't meant to go further, that certain dreams stayed distant because they were meant to arrive whole. This isn't fate correcting a mistake, it's alignment finishing its work. And the reason it feels calm instead of explosive is because you're no longer fighting the timing. You're meeting it. Sunday energy doesn't ask you to build, it asks you to integrate, to let what you've learned settle into your bones. And once it does, once the past stops pulling at your attention, you realize something quietly powerful. Nothing was wasted. Not the waiting, not the detours, not the moments where you thought you were behind. They were shaping you into someone who could receive without fear, someone who could hold abundance without guilt, someone who could live instead of endure. So let this Sunday be what it is: a soft landing, a deep breath, a closing of a door you no longer need to stand in front of. Because what opens next doesn't require force, it requires presence. And now that you're here, grounded, clear, and no longer rushing ahead of yourself, there's only one thing left to do. Step forward differently. And this is where everything settles. Not with fireworks, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet knowing that stays with you even after the sound fades. This Sunday, the 28th, was never meant to rush past you. It was meant to mark something. A turning point you can feel in your body more than you can explain with words. The 3 shifts you've just moved through, they aren't moments you watch and move on from. They're foundations, the kind you build a different life on. You released what was burning you from the inside. You allowed value to return without forcing it. And you learned how to see clearly without hardening your heart. That's not a temporary change. That's a new way of moving through the world. You're no longer charging forward blindly. You're no longer confusing motion with direction. You're no longer trying to outrun your own exhaustion. You've learned when to pause, when to choose, when to let life meet you instead of chasing it. And that's what real strength looks like now. Not louder, not sharper, steadier. If you're listening to this and something in you feels calm, even emotional, even unexpectedly relieved, that's not coincidence. You didn't arrive here by accident. You arrived because you're finally ready to receive without guilt, without bracing, without asking yourself if it will be taken away. You don't need to earn peace anymore. You don't need to justify rest. You don't need to prove that you deserve what's coming next. This chapter doesn't ask you to suffer for meaning. It asks you to live with intention. And living, for you, will look different now, more grounded, more honest, less reactive. You'll notice it in how you respond instead of react, in how you say no without explanation, in how you let things unfold without gripping them. The fire inside you is still there, but now it warms instead of burns. It lights the path instead of consuming you. And if part of you still wonders, what if I mess this up? What if I lose it? What if I'm wrong? Let me tell you something softly. You're not starting from scratch. You're starting from experience. You've already survived what once felt unbearable. You've already carried weight that shaped you. You've already learned how to stand when things fell apart. Now you get to live from that wisdom, not relive the struggle that taught it. So if this message touched you, if it reached that quiet place inside where hope and caution have been living side by side, you don't need to explain it. Just acknowledge it. Leave a sign in the comments if you feel called. A word, a simple yes, a quiet recognition that something has shifted, not for anyone else, for you. Because this isn't the end of the story. It's the moment you stop running through it and begin walking it with intention. And from here on out, you're not moving blindly. You're moving forward, aware, awake, and ready. Aries, before you go, let me leave you with this. What you just felt wasn't coincidence. And it wasn't imagination. It was recognition. Something inside you knew. This message was speaking your language, not the language of fear, not the language of pressure, but the language of truth. This turning point didn't arrive to impress you. It arrived to meet you, right where you are, as you are. And here's the part most people miss. The moment you stop running blindly, the moment you stop proving, the moment you stop carrying what was never yours, life doesn't get smaller. It gets clearer. You don't need to rush into the next chapter. You're already standing inside it. So if your chest feels warm right now, if your breath feels slower, if something in you quietly whispered, "Yes, this is it," trust that. That's your inner fire speaking with wisdom instead of urgency. If you're an Aries and this message touched you, leave a sign in the comments. A single word, a simple yes. Not for me, for yourself. And if you're ready to keep walking this path with clarity, make sure you're subscribed. Because the journey doesn't end here. Another message is already forming. Another layer is coming. And the next chapter will meet you when the timing is right. Until then, stay grounded in your fire. Stay honest with your heart. And remember this. You were never meant to burn yourself down to light the way. You were meant to lead with awareness. The journey continues.